All right, we're going live. Here we go. Ready? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, we are live. Welcome everybody to Spark Talks. I'm pleased and really excited to have this conversation with you guys and with Shawn Pelletier about the gender pay gap. So I wanted to just say welcome and that I'm excited to chat with you, Shawn, about some recent events that are coming up and maybe some progress that's been made over the recent times on this exciting topic. So welcome. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you, Dan. I am absolutely thrilled to be back. This is my third time talking to Spark. And so this is it's a super important topic, and it couldn't have came at a better time.
Yeah, you're our expert. So we love having these types of conversations with you. So again, we appreciate you, but I think we'll be respectful of people's time. We'll keep this kind of around a half hour. So we'll just jump right into it. So we're all here to talk about the gender pay gap. So I was hoping you could define it for us and we can get right to it.
Sure. So for many industrialized countries, the gender pay gap means there are systemic differences between the average wages or salary of men and those of women. So another way to think about it is it's a measure of how far the US must go to ensure that women can participate fully and equally in our economy.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I feel like it's been a buzzword if you've been watching the news, or it gets brought up every once in a while. But I think with more and more women entering the workforce than ever before, it impacts a lot of us. I mean, obviously, it impacts all of us. My wife works. I have aunts that work and cousins that work as well. So it does, even though it doesn't impact me directly, it does impact me and my family. So I'm curious just to kind of dispel some things that I'm curious about. But this means that, you know, men and women who are in the same exact position with the same experience and the same education, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So, you know, as you think about this, and I guess I want to put some context around it, you know, when we say the same, I mean, it's generally the same because there's always, you know, little nuances there. But, you know, one way to think about the gender pay gap is half of the workforce is made up of women, but yet men and women are not paid the same, okay, when they're doing the same job as you're talking about. So the current gender pay gap is averaging 83 cents. So what this means is that women who work full time are paid 83 cents for every dollar paid to a man. So another way to think about this is women must work longer than 12 months. So work longer in a calendar year to earn what a man earns in 12 months.
Yeah, and that number is staggering because you kind of just you assume that it's the same. You assume that $1 for me is the same as $1 for you, and that's just simple. But the data is showing that that's not the case. So, like, if I was going to do a little bit of investigating personally, or if our viewers wanted to check out this data, where can they find this information?
Yeah, great question. There are tons of data out there. And before I share that, I just want to make a disclaimer. You know, as I talk about man, okay, in this context of every dollar paid to a man, I'm referring to a non-Hispanic white man. Okay. And the reason I just wanted to call this out is because it's very clear in the research. You know, they're very clear about how they're representing the data. So in order to prepare for our talk today, Dan, I took data from a combination of sources: the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, the American Association of University Women, the Harvard Business Review, and the Connecticut Mirror. And that's just a sample.
Yeah, Yeah, and I appreciate you doing all the research so that we can kind of share this information with everyone, because we're posting those resources here in the chat, I believe, shortly, so you can review it as you're listening, or you can check it out later. But it's important to take a look at, because as I think we've talked about, Shawn, that this isn't just some private organization that has its own agenda. This is statistics that are from the U.S. Department of Labor. That is, it's out there that this exists. That it's 83 cents to the dollar for women to do the same work. So it's fascinating information, and I think that that's where, in doing some of my own research, I had these like preconceived myths in my head that didn't really make sense when I started to do a little bit more research on it, and so I wanted to kind of debunk some of these, if you can, for us, because I'm sure that other people have those same myths inside their head. So one of them that I wrote down was that you said that women are paid 83 cents to every dollar that a man makes. Like, does this apply broadly to all women? I know that you mentioned the definition of a non-Hispanic man, but does that apply to all women, that 83 cents?
No, it doesn't. So women's earnings are determined by race and ethnicity.
Oh.
So for this talk, I'm going to contain the information, and I'm going to refer to white, Black, and Latino women.
Mm-hmm.
So while women working full-time earn 83 cents to every dollar paid to a man, okay, so that's for white women, 83
Mm-hmm.
cents. For Black women, 63 cents. For Latino women, it's 54 cents. So I want to walk through this a little bit more and share an illustration with you to help make this real in terms of what do you mean work longer in a calendar year.
Yeah.
So for white women working full-time, they must work 15 months to earn what a man earns in 12 months. Literally from January 2022 to March 2023. Okay, 15 months.
Right.
Black women working full-time must work 19 months to earn what a man earns in 12 months. So January 2020 to August of 2023. And then the last one, Latino women working full-time must work 22 months to earn what a man earns in 12 months. So from January last month, January 2020 to October 2023.
It just doesn't, it feels like it doesn't make sense. It's just like the numbers are just really shocking to me. The fact that a Latino woman almost has to work 2 years to have the same amount of income as a male in her same position. This is baffling, and that's why I think it's important that we're having these conversations to bring it to light and to tell people about it so that we can kind of debunk these myths. So it's really interesting data. The second myth, to kind of like dovetail off of that, is that I would imagine that like the longer you work, the more opportunity you have to close this gap. Obviously, in my mind, logically, it feels like the longer you work, the more pay raises you get, or the more that there is to close that gap. Is that true?
No. I mean, it makes sense what you're assuming. We all assume that the longer you're there, the more skills you get, the more tenure you have, the more opportunity. It totally makes sense to think that. But here's what the data shows. The data shows that the gender pay gap widens with job level and age. So one way to think about it is, as women progress in their careers, the research shows that the pay gap widens for a variety of reasons. And here's just a few. One, there's less access and opportunities for women at the higher ranks or executive levels. Two, there's a motherhood penalty, which means after a woman has taken time off and returns to the workforce, many women have incurred wage penalties. And then three, there's biases, conscious or unconscious, which plays a role in how standards are applied to men and women. So when I'm talking about standards, it's standards for promotions, standards for raises. I just wanted to qualify that statement.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I was totally off base, and I'm sure I'm not alone in thinking that, and that's why it's a myth. But yeah, it's fascinating. There's so much that I don't know personally, or that I'm sure that our public and our viewers don't quite know. So again, reiterating why it's important that we have these conversations. The next myth that I had written down that I'm sure is pretty common is that, with more women than ever attending universities, does equal education necessarily mean equal pay? I think we talked about it a little bit before, but are we getting any closer to closing the pay gap with more women earning college degrees or advanced degrees?
The short answer is no. I mean, it's nice to think equal education means equal pay, but the data just doesn't support it. And so even though there's more females obtaining degrees and advanced degrees, it hasn't closed the gap.
Mhm.
So men and women between the ages of 20 and 24 have the smallest pay gap.
Mm.
So if we think about an example, so let's take two college graduates, a male and a female. At that time, their qualifications are very similar, if not the same, as they enter their first job.
Mhm.
Men tend to negotiate more than women, so that contributes to the pay gap. But getting back to our example of the two college graduates, so if the male in this case negotiates $3,000 more and it's accepted, okay, right off the gap, right out of the gate, they're starting with a little bit of a gap because they're not
Mm.
starting at the same, even though, on paper they may be the same, their qualifications may be the same right there. There is a little bit of a difference.
Wow.
What I've found from my own experience, as well as what the research shows, is over time there are many, many factors that play a role into the gender pay gap. It's experience, age, race, years that you've worked in a specific field. The industry makes a difference. Could be a
Mhm.
male-dominated industry, could be a female-dominated industry, the role within the industry, and certainly education level.
Mhm.
So it's a combination of reasons. And
Okay.
here's an example that I just wanted to share with you is the research shows that women working full-time with master's degrees are paid less than men with bachelor's degrees.
Mm. Hmm. And again, to reiterate, that's in the same field, right? Because I feel like
Yeah,
a common argument is that, oh, well, it depends, or it depends on performance, or it depends on what they negotiate. But the research is showing that some of those variables get wiped out because it's the same experience, the same type of job, or similar industry,
yeah.
so similar rank. So I think that's again another part of the myth that a woman with a master's degree is being paid less for the same job than a man with a bachelor's degree, even though she's done 2 more years of school,
Right,
or more
right,
in some cases.
right.
So it really paints a picture, and that's what I'd like to do if we can, is to zoom out a little bit to talk about kind of some progress that's been made, and in light of recent events. I know we were texting about this, and it's like, did you see that this happened? I'm not sure if anybody
Right.
else has seen, but the U.S. national women's soccer team. It's a very timely conversation to have, based on our gender pay gap conversation, because they just successfully navigated a lawsuit with the U.S. Soccer Federation for equal pay. So I know that we'll touch on that briefly, but my question is kind of what progress has been made, because I think that we're starting to be more cognizant of it. We're seeing these news headlines that equal pay is winning some lawsuits in some different cases. So I'm curious what progress we've made across the board.
Yeah, great question. I mean, clearly there has been progress made here in Connecticut, in the US, and abroad.
Mhm.
And I'm just going to give you some highlights, just to share with you the amount of progress that's been made. So if we start at a global level, there are countries that have made significant progress towards equal pay in countries like Iceland and Finland, to name a few.
Mhm.
In the US, as you mentioned just 2 days ago, the US national women's soccer team, they reached a settlement in a class action lawsuit on equal pay.
Mm.
So the bottom line is the fight isn't over, not by a long shot, but it certainly shines a light on this topic in sports and beyond. Certainly within the US, there's probably been about 20 states that have passed laws prohibiting employers from asking questions about salary history. And what this does is it allows the candidate the opportunity to discuss compensation based on skills. What do they bring to the table?
Yeah.
And fair market value. It's not a discussion, it's not solely based on your past
Mm.
salary history.
Yeah, and that's, if I could jump in for a second, I think that's fascinating to me, and I didn't realize, I guess maybe because I'm not hiring and up to date with some of these laws, but obviously that is extremely helpful for anybody who had a previous job where maybe they didn't negotiate, and they experienced that gap at that previous job, and they're moving on to the next one, that they don't necessarily have to disclose what they were paid before, that they can negotiate or can help themselves now that they maybe have done the research or are aware of the pay gap or things like that. So that's really interesting that you don't necessarily have that hiring knowledge of what their person's previous salary was. Thanks for sharing that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, having more discussions around fair market value will
Mm.
clearly help close the gap. It's not
Mm.
the only thing, but it helps move it in the right direction.
Yeah,
The
totally.
other piece is the pay gap varies by state across the US.
Mm.
So, what I mean is in Wyoming, they pay women 65 cents for every dollar paid to a man.
Mm.
Compare that to Vermont, where they pay women 91 cents for every dollar paid to a man. Here in Connecticut, women are paid 84 cents.
Mhm.
So for those of us in Connecticut, one way to look at it is after November 3rd, women stop getting paid, though they work until the end of the year.
Right. Whereas in Vermont, it's probably December, and in Wyoming, it's what, June? I mean,
Oh yeah.
yeah,
Who knows? Probably August, but yeah.
yikes.
Yeah, it's just wrong,
Yeah.
you know.
Mhm.
And then the last piece that I want to mention about in Connecticut is there was a Public Act 2130 concerning the disclosure of salary range for a vacant position.
Mm.
And this was a law that was passed a few months ago, and it's now in effect. And what this means is it requires employers to provide the job applicants with a pay range for that vacant position.
Mm.
So to me, again, it's another step in the right direction. And this one in particular helps to support pay transparency.
Yeah, and I think it's a great segue into kind of what my next question was, because as we're learning all these things and hearing about examples of other states and how they're handling it, or how they're impacting and closing the gap, the question obviously comes up that, like, even for myself, like, what can I do about it? Since we've had this on the schedule, I've been talking with my wife about the gender pay gap, and we've been kind of researching it together, and it's very fascinating. But kind of what can I do, or what can she do to advocate for herself, or to close the gap, so that we can help bring Connecticut closer to that zero lump sum?
Yeah, well, exactly what you and I are doing.
Mm.
We're talking about it. And we have to keep talking about it and keep putting it, front and center. What I find is that when I talk to both men and women, they're certainly aware of the gender pay gap,
Mhm.
but they're not exactly sure how it directly impacts them. Like, how does this really impact me? Or how does it impact my community?
Mhm.
You know, People don't necessarily have those details. They know it's kind of that problem over there, but there's not a lot of clarity on how it impacts them.
Mm.
And to me, it's a we problem. It's not a she problem. And I
Mhm.
say we because the more we understand the long-term impact of it in terms of retirement savings, social security, the better chance we can solve this.
Mm.
So for example, if the pay gap was eliminated in the US, on average, there'd be more money in your household.
Mm.
And here's some tangible examples just to help you. So there'd be more money to provide 13 additional months of childcare, 7 additional months of premiums for employer-based health insurance, 6 additional months of mortgage payments, 74 weeks of food.
Shoot.
And so when you think about some of these examples, these are everyday needs. These are monthly needs. These are yearly needs. It definitely impacts everyone.
Wow. Yeah, those numbers are wild. Imagine what you could do with all that back in your family's bank account. I mean, it really does impact us.
Yeah. The second thing is get informed about what's happening at a national level and a state level that brings attention to the issue.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great point, actually, because I know that for Spark, we have a few dedicated professionals who are a part of our leadership team that are about bringing some legislation and advocacy education to our young professionals. So that's going to be a big thing, that we can impact our community through these things that we believe in or that we want to change. It's not just, crossing your fingers and hoping that it's going to get done. You can be the change that you want to see in your community through conversations with your legislators or through your lobbyists or things like that. So stay tuned. A shameless plug for future Spark events that are going to focus on those. But yeah, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm sure there's other things that we can do too.
Yeah, no, and I think that's so important, because I think the more people get involved, there's more pressure. There's more pressure to take action.
Mm.
So I think it's great if Spark can play an advocacy role. The more the better. I think that's wonderful. My third point is, if you're an employee, ask your employer, have they done a pay audit? It'll be interesting to see if they've done one. And if so, can they share the results? If you're a business, do a pay audit to see where you are. This may or may not be an issue, but just do it. And look across the compensation ranges to see if anything stands out, as well as have clear, accurate, and complete job descriptions for that comparison of skills, efforts, and responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
Also think about supporting pay transparency. I know this always makes people uncomfortable, but there's a lot of good reasons why companies should do pay transparency. And I'm not saying it's the right solution for everyone, but certainly people should look into it and think about it and think about, is this the right thing to do? And then the last point is, regardless of where you are in your career, negotiate. Absolutely negotiate.
Yeah, that I think that's the biggest one that stands out to me. That's like totally controllable, and especially for young professionals, where we sometimes feel like, oh, I just graduated, I don't have the experience, or I'm transitioning to a new industry. I don't have the clout to go into an interview and say, well, this is my salary, or negotiate for what is livable for you. I mean, if you're not having the conversation at all, then there's no chance that you can negotiate that gap. So I think that's a great point, especially to spur on young professionals or people changing careers, that you have the power to negotiate, even though it might be uncomfortable. It's something that you need to think about.
Right. And I'm so glad that you brought that up about, some young professionals may feel that, they're not in a position to negotiate. It's totally wrong. There is such a thing as the ask gap, ASK. The ask gap perpetuates the gender pay gap. So, my advice is, do your homework, do the research for the field that you work in, understand your skills, understand what you bring to the table, and negotiate. You have nothing to lose, and certainly it's worth it for you. You need to ask what you believe that you deserve.
Yeah, and that's the big component that you slid in there. I don't know if everybody caught it, but it's like, make sure you're doing your research too. Don't just go in like willy-nilly and like hope that you can get a different salary or things like that. It's like, all right, look on Glassdoor, look on those resources that are out there for labor and statistics that show, someone in this position in this area of the country should be making this, and this is what I'm going to stand by. But you're right, we need to narrow that gap.
Yeah, and it's called fair market value. I mean, and also to your point about do your research, it's also going to depend on where you are in the country. I mean, clearly we're all in Connecticut. Okay, so in the Northeast, the salaries tend to be higher because the cost of living is higher. But you know what? 6 months, you might be taking a job, in the state of Washington.
Mm-hmm.
So things are different. So again, just as you said, Dan, do the research. I think you'll be surprised, but it's just tools that are available to you to help yourself be equipped to have the best discussions that you can have.
Yeah. And I think that kind of rounds out the things that we were going to cover. But as we were talking, I had this question that pops into my head. So I hope it's okay if I ask you this. But obviously, with everything that's happened over the last few years, everybody is transitioning to jobs and maybe even working more remotely. But I think the job search is always ongoing. But that's just one way that the pandemic kind of impacted us. But as far as the gender pay gap, like how did the pandemic and everything that happened in 2020 and is still ongoing, how did that impact the gender pay gap, or did it? I don't know. I guess I'm asking.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. And the shorter answer is yes, absolutely yes.
Okay.
It impacted the gender pay gap. And I just want to put some context around this. The pandemic disproportionately affected women. And the reason I say this is because of the job sectors that are largely represented by women. Tourism, hospitality, personal care. So a lot of those businesses, were hit really hard in 20, even the beginning of 21. So certainly, there's a lot of people were hit hard financially. And as the economy comes back and as women return to the workforce, there may be wage penalties. And if there are wage penalties, that will widen the gap in subsequent years. And I read this interesting article from PayScale, and they put out a report on this, and it was talking about this very issue. So, in a couple of the examples that they gave were women who were laid off and then returned to work earn 77 cents for every dollar earned by a man who was laid off. So what this suggests is that women pay a higher unemployment penalty than men. And so some of this, what I find is, in the here and now, it doesn't always feel real. But when you start to put pen to paper and you can look at it, in a more of a concrete way, it's very real. And, if the average is around 83 cents, but now you're knocked down to 77 cents, okay?
Yeah.
There's a decrease because of an unemployment penalty.
Yeah. Wow. I keep coming back to that. The numbers are just baffling. And so I would encourage all of you to don't even take our word for it. Obviously, we're just mouthpieces for information here, but the numbers are out there. And that's why we're sharing the data points with you and sharing those sites where we're having this conversation based off of, so that you can make a decision for yourself on how to move forward. But I appreciate you coming on again, Shawn. Always a pleasure, obviously, to have these important conversations. But I appreciate everybody else for tuning in, and we're looking forward to continuing this conversation and having many others that we can hold to impact our community as young professionals. So thank you again, Shawn, for coming on and doing all the research.
Oh, you are welcome. I really appreciate it. And I am happy to come back. We could have a sequel to this, because there's other components that we didn't touch on. So I think it's important that we continue to educate and just raise that level of education.
Totally.
So thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you again, Shawn. And obviously everybody who's tuning in now, keep your ears tuned for other events that are coming up through about advocacy or legislation, or, like Shawn said, part 2 of this conversation. And we'll go from there. So thank you guys. This is Dan and Shawn signing off, and we'll see you next time.
Okay,
Thanks,
take
everyone.
care. Bye.